I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Michael Jansen, Chief Research Guru, guides the practice's research agenda and architecture. As co-founder of Everest Group Research Practice, Michael leverages his extensive experience identifying and understanding emerging trends, helping organizations maximize their global services efforts. Abhishek Sharma, partner, provides delivery leadership on all of Everest Group's pricing assurance engagements, assisting clients on topics related to price and contract benchmarking, strategic engagement reviews, and sourcing cost rationalization. Ashint Arora, Practice Director, leads custom engagements for next-generation digital services in areas such as application modernization and IT automation, as well as heads up development of such membership offerings as Everest Group multi-country price benchmarking catalog. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Michael. Take it away, Michael.
All right, thank you, Lucy. And certainly whenever we're having a webinar or a research topic around pricing, we get a great deal of interest. And as I see the number of participants in this webinar, I'm equally encouraged by that statement. So today we're going to talk about output-based pricing in the application services arena. It's a hot topic. We know that the way that application services are being sold is changing, and we're also seeing a corresponding change in the way they're being priced. So we're going to show you today some of what we're seeing. We're going to talk about some of the motivations, some of the challenges with that shift into output-based pricing, and we're going to talk to also how to avoid the pitfalls when moving in that direction. So as we get started here, we wanted to show you some definitions, and those definitions are going to be broken into 3 categories. And as we go forward here, Abhishek, why don't you start with providing us some context here?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. So just some fundamental definitions, as Michael mentioned, because the interpretation of these names could sometimes vary by organization, as we've seen in our interactions, right? So just for consistency's sake, a quick refresher, right? Output-based pricing is all about the operational result. It could be the processed invoice, a processed claim, it could be a service request, it could be a ticket. So yeah, that's something about output-based. Outcome-based is how we define pricing as linked to the actual business outcome, something like the savings achieved from sourcing and category management, right? So that's not an output per se, but that's something that's much closer to heart to the business, and that's why it's a business outcome. Input-based pricing, I believe, needs little introduction. That's more about things like on a rate per hour or per day basis, which is more about how things, what's the effort which goes into delivering that activity, right? So having set this context, I also want to take a minute to cover why really is this topic important. So if we move to the next page. Now, this is based on a survey we conducted in the second half of 2018 across 50+ enterprises. And as you can see, this specific chart is one of the many that we created basis the insights from that survey. So net, what this tells is that, specifically for IT applications, fixed price and input-based is expected to see a downfall in terms of, relative adoption. And output and outcome are definitely going to be on the rise. So as you can see, the difference between the past 2 to 3 years versus what respondents expected in the next 2 to 3 years is kind of jumping from the 22% to 27%, right? And this obviously comes at the cost of the fixed price and others. So clearly a relevant topic, combined with the results from this survey, which we're representing, we can vouch for the fact that over the past 12 odd months, the number of conversations, the level of interest that this has generated in our enterprise and provider conversations just points exactly in the same direction. Let's move ahead now.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to break this webinar up into 3 sections. We're going to talk about the types of output-based pricing. We're going to talk about those factors that are driving adoption. We'll talk about the key success, and then we'll move into questions. And so if you do have questions along the way, go ahead and enter them into the chat box or the question box, and we'll be happy to try to take those along the way if it makes sense. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is before we start showing you data more data anyway, we want to hear where you think the state of the industry is from your perspective. So we're going to open up a quick poll here that says, ask you how much exposure has your organization had to output-based pricing in the application services. So quick answer here, have you never heard of it? Are you aware of what it is, but not yet implementing it? Are you planning to implement it? Do you have mature adoption, or and maybe you're one of the organizations that have taken it all the way to the full adoption level? And we'll leave the poll open here for just a few minutes or a few seconds more. Okay, all right, got a good number of votes here. Let's go ahead and close the poll and post it up there. And Abhishek, we got some really good information right in the middle of the spectrum there.
Yeah.
Roughly 1/3, a quarter are aware of it, full third are planning to do it, and not quite a third are mature adopters in this area. So what do you think about that?
Absolutely, Michael. So I can clearly see quite a spectrum there. Never heard of it is kind of low, which I'd expected. But across the board, you can see it's a pretty homogeneous distribution across people who are aware but not yet implemented and planning to implement. So if we combine these two, that forms the biggest chunk, right? Almost like close to 60% that, hey, awareness and some kind of interest. So I think it reverberates some of the thoughts which I shared a few minutes ago around the findings from the survey. Also heartened to see that a good amount, a good percentage are adopting this, in a mature manner, and also some seeing this as commonly adopted. So yeah, clearly, positive points for the industry. Okay, sounds good. So that was an interesting poll. Now, if I were to just peel the onion a little bit, now this section is all about just kind of discussing the types of output-based models. Now, this pricing in an application standpoint is not a homogeneous concept, right? The models, the specific models could vary depending on the dynamics of the underlying resource unit. Now, one model, as you can see on the left-hand side of the page, is where the application per se is the resource unit. Now, different types of applications are in this case assigned a score, which could be based on multiple parameters, which we'll cover in short order. And the pricing per month or per annum is then agreed depending on the tier of the application, right? So again, this forms the basis of invoicing by the provider, more of a simplistic manner, agree on a certain number of tiers, and then have everything linked to that particular application. I'd say that this is somewhat analogous to what we see in the infrastructure side as a per user pricing on a desktop services or service desk, etc. So just trying to make some analogies with other areas like this we've seen. The other option, right, which is a lot more granular, is to go for a transaction-based model represented on the right-hand side of the page, where the pricing is based on specific activities or transactions, right? So this could be a per incident, priority of tickets, etc. So much more granular, not just based on the application per se, but the activity. And the key difference being that, whereas in the former application-based model, it's an all-in price, which subsumes all the effort needed per application, the latter has it at a much more granular or atomic level linked to the actual activity, right? So again, we've tried to draw some differences between these two, and we'll start discussing a bit more about the application-based model. Achin, while the application-based pricing looks simple, right? At the outset,
right.
Whenever we see it in rate cards, it's, hey, these tiers, this is the price per month, looks extremely simple, but we know,
right.
That there's a number of underlying tenets behind the pricing. So do you want to share some of that, as we have it on the next page?
Okay, thank you, Abhishek. So while the per application model seems to be simple, it seems to be structured like a few application tiers here and there, but there are a lot of underlying factors that can really impact what the pricing should be. So we are running through some of those influencing factors here. So the 6 factors that we see that can play a major role when it comes to the application-based pricing are the business criticality, as in what drives the support coverage and the resource seniority, as well as the fact where those resources are based out of. The second can be a geographical consideration, especially with the fact that multiple geographies have different outsourcing maturities. Similarly, an enterprise might prefer to have the different resources in terms of the offshoring leverage or the nearshore leverage as well. The third can be your volumes. I mean, volume play a real good impact on your application-based pricing, and the distribution among the incident, service requests, and the problems that can really impact your pricing as well. Now, we also have seen that some of the service providers do also consider the fact that an application can be cloud-based, an application can be an on-premise. So that also really impacts, especially with the fact that the cloud-based application would have the related monitoring costs and the customization needs to be on the lower side as compared to the on-premise application. So that can also really impact your pricing. The next one is the need for change, as in how frequently your releases are being done on a particular application. So a front-end application that requires more number of changes would definitely and should have a different pricing that a back-end app that sees maybe once in a quarter kind of a release. And the last one, and one of the most important, would be the technology type. So an application-based pricing can be influenced by the fact that whether if it's a custom application or is it an ERP application, or if you are talking about the next generation cloud applications. So that the next page puts some of these in perspective.
Yeah, so before you go to the question here, Abhishek, I want to ask you about, there's a question that we got on the panel, or from the webinar participants here, about the question about scale. So if you go back to the previous slide, what do we think about scale in terms of how this is implemented, when it's implemented?
Sure. So clearly that's a good question. Now, if you were to look at scale, the basic premise is that whenever you have a per application kind of model, right? And as Achint will walk through some of the mechanics behind it, clearly, a certain modicum of scale is important, right? You can't just typically have a deal which just covers 10 applications and then divide them into 7 tiers. It just doesn't make sense. One of the premises also for going for something like an application-based model is where there potentially is going to be flux in the number of applications, for example, being managed, right? So that it's much easier to cut, add on, delete, etc. Otherwise, just going into change control mode. So yes, is there a number I can put? Perhaps difficult, right? But clearly, mid to large scale is where this is most applicable, as opposed to just short scale deals. The one thing I'll also mention is that from a governance standpoint, these models tend to be a bit more complex, right, to manage and agree on. So again, there's the whole trade-off between, hey, what's the total spend versus adding so much more governance effort, right, just for the sake of it. So clearly, mid to large size deals, that would be my feedback on that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So as we go to the next slide, we are talking about a more granular level, and this information is distilled, as you can see. So these are the different factors that can really impact your application-based pricing. And this is just one of those illustrative views on how a matrix can look like. The influencing factors will be having different weightages. Now, all of these would, put together, be sum to 100. But if you can see, there can be a different way of constructing these tiers, and a score can be attributed depending upon an enterprise preference. So if there are situations where a business criticality would have a higher weightage as compared to a support coverage, especially where you have a larger team in place and the cross leverage is really possible, as compared to there are situations where a regulatory impact would have a really high weightage, especially for those enterprises that have the requirement to have local resources. So net, there are multiple factors, there are weightages assigned to it, and all these things put together help you to arrive at certain tiers based on the application scope. And if you go to the next slide, we have articulated that. So if you see this slide, we have talked about that how a typical per application pricing tier would look like. So we have talked about 6 different tiers here: the diamond, the platinum, gold, silver, bronze, and copper. And then accordingly, what is the typical application score that can be seen for these applications, and what would be the associated price. Now, this is all very simple to look at, but as you have seen in the previous slide, this requires a lot more rigor when it comes to arriving at those prices. And while you can see that this model typically represents your application maintenance services in a managed services construct, There have been specific use cases seen in development services as well when it comes to application-based tiering. So having said that, now Abhishek will walk us through the transaction-based pricing model, which has a wider applicability across the life cycle.
Sure, thanks, Sachin. So again, the application-based model, while it can technically be applied through the life cycle, mainstream examples still point more to an app maintenance kind of scope. Now, conversely, transaction-based models can be applied across various stages of the life cycle, primarily because how you define the transaction, there's a lot more flexibility, right? So in the development space, it could cover even agile concepts like a per story point or per sprint, for example, and a more traditional, per function point view. Right, so there's a lot more flexibility over there on how to run it. Similarly, across testing, it could be predicated on test cases or test reports. For maintenance, of course, on a per incident, per ticket pricing example. So again, a lot more diverse resource units, but it also comes with its own flexibility on how to structure it. The premise here is to encourage the delivery or resolution of activity in the leanest way possible, right? So a lower cost for enterprise and effectively a higher margin or optimal utilization for the service provider. Now, having talked about both of these models, right, the per application and on a per transaction-based model, let me just quickly compare the applicability of both these models on the next page before we head into some of the other stuff that we want to discuss today. So, as it would have been evident, there's really no one-size-fits-all when it comes to output-based models, right? So for application-based pricing, the premise is to stratify all elements into one fee without an explicit need to track a lot of metrics for pricing, right? So the most suitable scenarios seem to be where there are relatively limited metrics or where transformation is leading to the app's portfolio being constantly changed, right? So a point I made a few minutes ago around it's easy to basically take something out, add something in based on the tiers without really having to do a lot of mathematics around it. And in some way, as this involves kind of a fixed fee per application type, organizational experience with fixed fee models, is also important, right? So these are some of these. Now, obviously, these are not exhaustive. That we can actually talk for hours just on applicability, but just for the purposes of this conversation, these were, some areas where the former model works better. On the other hand, the transaction-based model is all about discrete, different pricing metrics. And significant amounts of underlying data availability around them, right? So that's why it's seen to be more suitable where there are mature metrics, i.e., where the source it's coming from, there's agreement on the applicability of those metrics, portfolio is relatively stable, and there's organizational experience, most importantly, with pay-per-use kind of metrics, right? So it's as much about the underlying activity as it is about the organization philosophy and comfort with a particular kind of a commercial model. So this summarizes what we wanted to cover in this section, right? Now, in the subsequent pages, we'll just cover some of the driving factors, over the next few pages.
Yeah, and Abhishek, there's a whole bunch of questions here. I'm going to just pick one of them on there in terms of who's driving this in the marketplace. I know you're going to talk a little bit about why, but who's driving this in the market from your perspective? The service providers or the buyers?
Actually, it's a mix of both, right? There's scenarios where we've seen enterprises, the buyers pushing for this, where they've kind of done some of their due diligence, some of maturity on their side, either from advisors or they've heard from their peers, etc. We've also seen cases of late where providers have actually taken this proactively, right? If I were to just draw a bit of an inflection point, we've seen this to happen a bit more in cases where it's getting closer to renewal, right? In a typical steady state where it's 5 years, 4 years down the line, the incentivization or push, truth be told, right, just being brutally honest, it tends to be slightly lower, right? Not to say that it cannot happen or does not happen, but we've seen more instances where getting close to renewal, the provider may want to kind of use this as something to showcase more value, showcase better sense of flexibility, and eventually try to get things sole source, because there's quite a lot. So much as we would like to give a very definitive answer that it's A versus B, right? The truth is that it's actually varying by situation, right, as we see.
Okay, great. So as we move into our next section, we're going to talk about some of those adoption factors here. But once again, we're going to start this section with a quick poll, and what we're aiming to get here is, understand what does the audience think in terms of the biggest motivation for enterprise to switch to output-based pricing. So we're going to give you some more answers than that in a second here, but we'd like to get your perspective. Is it to increase the transparency? Is it to incentivize continuous improvement? Is it supporting applications rationalization? Is it a reduction in TCO, total cost of ownership, or more flexibility? Pick one of those and tell us which one you think is the biggest motivation. Okay, got over half the people who participated, moving up quickly. All right, we'll close it here in 3 seconds. Fantastic. Okay, here we got the answers now. So again, a pretty diverse split here. Certainly some favoritism to the reduction in total cost of ownership, and not really much there for application rationalization. So definitely the TCO is the big one there, and then looking at higher degrees of flexibility is number 2 here. What are your thoughts on that, Abhishek?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, cost always remains. We've seen, in a lot of the polls, a major consideration. It is. And let's face it, right? That there's hardly, in today's world, right, with so much of uncertainty, almost every year, every 6 months, things are changing. Clearly, things are being tightened. In 1 year, it could be one sector. The other one, it could be another, right? So yes, cost control is paramount. Interesting to see, especially around flexibility as well. And the way we actually see it, flexibility and transparency somehow can be seen interchangeably, but interesting. Yeah, I mean, what's a bit surprising is a lower focus on the app rationalization initiatives. But then again, we recognize that this is a second order kind of implication of some of these. So yeah, interesting thoughts there. You see some of these being resonated and perhaps a little more as Achin talks through what we see on the next page as some of the key benefits of this model for enterprises. Again, please bear in mind, this is not by no means exhaustive. This is more of a representation of what we see stuff as most common.
Okay, thanks, Abhishek. So while the cost of ownership is definitely really important for all the enterprises, we also see that it also entails that this model brings a lot of transparency. So if we see the traditional models such as fixed fee models, they are more of a black box where you only know that at the end of the month, you are paying some monthly fees, but you don't know how the underlying operations are really going on. This model kind of put light onto that black box and help you understand really how exactly your baselines are happening and what exactly your volumes and your continuous improvement are impacting your pricing. Now this also gives you better visibility and encourages you from transformation by asking the broader question around replace, retire, or rebuild. Now the flexibility question, the poll around flexibility really flows into this because a lot of enterprises that are dynamic, that have their portfolio becoming really dynamic and changing, they want that kind of a flexibility to happen. So they want to decide whether they want to retire their application, replace, or even upgrade. They want to have better support coverage for those applications. So this model really brings that flexibility nuance really well. Now we can also think of that it gives you better insight into the spend outlay by an application and clarity on how continuous improvement is happening and can be optimized across your portfolio. It also gives you flexibility to easily adjust the price in case of an application portfolio change. Now it doesn't entail that you need to go through a long change orders and which are very complex, and every time you need to come onto the table when it comes to estimating or you need to change your models. It gives you a really quick way to change your spend portfolio. And the last is it also helps enterprises become comfortable with the nuance, with the idea of value-based pricing. So as you might appreciate that the journey in a pricing model, it's always a journey. I mean, moving from one pricing model to another. So we had the T&M, then we go to the fixed fee, then we talk about the output-based pricing, and the last one is the outcome of the value-based pricing. So this model helps you travel that journey. And this model is not only for enterprises. There are concrete benefits for the service providers too, as articulated in the next page. Okay. Now for service providers, what's in it for them? At the outset, it helps them differentiate their capabilities. And I mean, wherever possible, where it is good for them, they can even charge a higher fee for any premium service, especially around if there are applications that require a better support coverage that might be really business critical, and where they are putting their top-notch A-grade talent. They can even charge a bit more on those applications. They can actually de-link the fees from the actual hours. So the conversation is more about the value that they're getting out of an application, and not on the number of bodies that are working on those applications. It helps them really improve their margins. I mean, that is what the whole industry is right now aiming at, to de-link their revenue growth from the number of bodies and to increase their margins. It also gives you an enhanced opportunity for automation. I mean, year on year, the per application support price can really go down, and it can really lead to improved credentials within enterprises. I mean, it helps you establish those credentials that you already can reduce your per ticket pricing. You already have automation in place. So you are a player who can even do digital transformation and other major initiatives for the enterprise. It also focuses on activity output rather than the input base, which is like, I mean, you can see that a lot of conversations do derail when it comes to because of higher offshoring. Now, with that in place, the ticket-based pricing moves your attention away from those offshoring related discussions and more about the value you're getting from supporting an or developing an application. And the last one, it helps increase your maturity across a wider repertoire of pricing models. So doing more and more of output-based pricing models would make you better at doing it, more efficient at doing it, and realizing better value out of it. So Abhishek, this is quite a list. What do you think are the common motivators?
Yeah, so as we see on the next page, we just try to highlight, the top three, right? The way we see it, right? The way based on our conversations with the marketplace. So clearly for enterprises, it's, a bit about transparency, right? Transparency, flexibility, alignment with broader cloudification objectives, and then finally cost rationalization, right? It has to be one of the top three, linked to flexibility, etc. So again, some of these are interlinked, but broadly these are the themes which come around that. Okay. Now for enterprise, for service providers, right? It's of course, delinking the revenue from, the number of bodies, so to speak. Now, clearly the underlying factor, as I can see a question, pop up as well, that it'll never be possible to de-link, the whole cost from the number of bodies, right? It'll never happen this way. Clearly, everything is driven by that forms a building block, so to speak. But what this means is that the way things are being charged to the client, right? So there's a difference between how you build up the cost versus how the price is actually being charged out to the client. The de-linking we're talking about is more on the pricing side, right? Where it gets just, kind of, there is chance, if structured correctly, to perhaps get more revenue from lesser number of bodies, or even if the revenue reduces, you can reduce the number of bodies further, right? So that has an impact on margins. The second point, of course, is potential for better margins, right? Linked to what I just described, and then ability to drive value pricing, because for a number of years, certain relationships just get, I won't use the term caught in the web, let me use something a bit more benign, are just caught in a bit of an inertia around using a standard FTE based or input based pricing because of its own simplicity and ease of understanding. This gives an option or a step up to just get aligned to more value being driven out of the model, and this obviously leads to more opportunities to kind of drive value into the contract. Okay.
So Abhishek, I think there's a couple questions on here that kind of relate to the portfolio, and I don't think you guys are saying that the whole portfolio goes to this kind of pricing mechanisms. There's still going to be some FTE pricing. There's still going to be some other forms of pricing for application.
Absolutely. I mean, across the portfolio, there's going to be a whole lot, right? It could vary by the provider. It could vary by type of application, right? So at least in my 16 years of working, almost all the portfolios I've seen have been hybrid, right? So what we're talking about here is specific cases within the portfolio where things are moving towards it. This by no means implies that, hey, every other pricing model is shutting down, right? It's a bit of an osmosis between different pricing models. We see more of this coming through across the pot, so which is why we're having this discussion.
Okay, fantastic. And so I think in the next section we're going to get into, if you look at this particular pricing mechanism, and there's some clear tangible benefits, so why isn't everybody doing that? So we'll get to that in the next section, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, all right. So let's talk about those key execution. And again, as we go into this section, we want to give another quick poll here. And so what we're going to ask is, what do you believe is the most important reason that adoption of output-based pricing is low? So why is this not being utilized by more folks? So is it the lack of experience within the procurement teams? Is it difficulty to normalize to a specific environment? Is it the lack of initiative by the providers? Is it a comfort level with the control I guess you should say, is it comfort with the current process or input-based pricing, or is it some combination of all of the above? Okay, now we're going to have a clear winner here, I can see. All right, we'll give another 5 seconds here. Okay, good. You guys are good voters here. I can see the voting ramps up pretty quickly. Okay, all right, let's close the poll here. And so as you might expect in any new emerging trend here, a little bit of everything. And now, lack of initiative by providers is the only one that didn't come up in any substance, but all of the above, and then you combine that together with comfort level and difficulty and lack of experience, all three of those. So really a combination answer really is what I'm seeing here. Any thoughts on that, Abhishek?
I think all of the above. I'm actually not surprised. In my mind, I was thinking that would be somewhere around the 30-35%. It's getting closer to 50, which is interesting. It's also good to see that at least the group here, people who've shared their vote. They don't think that it's a bit of a provider issue, right? This happens to be a small percentage, so that's good, because sometimes it just comes up the fact that, hey, clients want to do it, providers don't show that initiative. But yeah, I think broadly it's it's within ranges as I'd expected, right?
Yeah, I mean it's just showing a relative lack of maturity at this point.
Correct. Right. Absolutely.
Okay.
All right, so let's talk about those. What makes these? Let's talk about the benefits, or why are these models complex to implement there?
Okay. So I mean, the models are complex, and there is no doubt that are they difficult to implement? Yes, they are. It's not going to be that easy. Some of the complexities arise from the data quality issues. I mean, a lot of enterprises might be having multiple ITSM systems which don't talk to each other. So they have different versions, different views of the data they have within the organization. So it's really not clear what does the real volume look like. Now, one of the complexities that we really hear about more common is the high risk premium. So that would effectively lead to a price that is much higher than even the input-based pricing model. So we at the starting of the poll, there was this conversation around, okay, reduce cost of ownership is the objective for many. But we have seen scenarios where after moving to output-based pricing, the overall TCO, which is the total cost of ownership, after putting together the infrastructure and the application pieces, it went up because it was not rightly baseline, and the service provider had really assumed a risk premium that was not necessary in that case. Now, one of the most, apart from that, then there are questions on the impact of volume variation. I mean, how do we go for off-season, on-season kind of conversation, and how do the inclusion or exclusion on a per application or per transaction phase should look like? It is important that the enterprises should focus on the impact in their context. I mean, there is no single, it's not a holy grail. There is no single benchmark or a single value that can justify the pricing that is being offered to you. So it should be looked not as I mean, from a pure attractiveness of the concept, but it should be looked from a more holistic way on how is it really going to benefit you. So before we cover the key execution steps, let's look at the next page for the prerequisites that are needed for a successful implementation of an output-based pricing model. Okay, so if you can see, there are top 6 measures. Again, these are not all of them, but these are the most important ones. So first is our accurate estimation model. I mean, there should be a lot of maturity when it comes to the estimation models and how your productivity is being targeted across the enterprise and across the portfolio you are targeting from an output-based pricing model. Now, your historical data is really important. I mean, the baselining of the volumes, the associated service levels, and the underlying assumptions that are impacting those volumes, or I mean, that are being really taken into consideration. I mean, they can really impact your output-based pricing. The next can be your streamlined processes. The demand management is really important. The fluctuation need to be really kept in consideration whenever you're targeting moving to an application-based pricing model or a transaction-based pricing model. And the last is the level of risk bloated in that, and it should be really discussed between both the parties. Sometimes, often we see that the conversation never goes around this, and there is an over baking or an under baking of risk that happens, and that can be really, I mean, detrimental for one of the parties involved in this pricing model. So our suggestion is always that the relationship should be open enough to have this conversation around risk premium. Having put these in context, the next page gets into some of the action steps one should think of.
Sure, thanks, Ajit. So just a bit of a, at the outset, I just want to make a statement as I walk through this page. There could be various means to achieve the result, right? This is by no means, the gospel truth that these are the particular order of steps, or these are the steps which need to be taken. What we've tried to do is just highlight what we feel are the material elements which perhaps should not be missed out. Okay, so clearly establishing the volume and effort baselines, ultra critical, right? Because when we're moving from something that's very tangible, right, like an input-based model or a number of FTEs working, right, you can identify, hey, it's Ajit Arora working or Abhishek Sharma, kind of, a developer or whatever, to something that's a bit intangible, right, per application, right? You need to know what really drives the effort into that application on a monthly basis, what drives the effort into a ticket, right? How much of a non-ticketing effort is required, right? So that rigor, we can't overemphasize the importance of this fact. It has to be tack sharp, right? Otherwise, clearly be prepared for some major issues going forward. Some of the biggest errors we have seen happen, when organizations have moved and they've had to either go back to the old models or significantly kind of revamp things, have been related to erroneous baselines, which often led to a severe pricing load, right? So that lack of data and the lack of diligence with data, just cannot be. It's ultra critical, right? Let me leave by saying that. Now, the second step once this is in place, it's about deciding the appropriate model, right? And how typically it's done is that while the tendency could be, if the intent is to keep the governance simple or an overall simple model, the application-based model looks simple from that standpoint. But in the wrong scenario where it's not applicable, it could actually be counterproductive, right? So both sides of the table, both enterprise and providers should run through the proper due diligence and actually perform some simulations, right? Especially the enterprise, they have to perform simulations to see, hey, what happens if the volume changes? What happens if the activities need to change or the tiers may change? And then what impact it has on an overall cost and service delivery perspective. Again, one of the errors we've seen is that while a lot of things happen on a theoretical level or even fundamentally people agree, lack of doing those even simple simulations or scenarios, then leaves that risk open going forward, that if things were to change drastically, that hasn't actually been factored into the decision, right? So again, that choice of the specific model is important. Related to this is point 3. Once you've decided that, what are those consumption units and their calculation approach? Those units, they are reflective of impact to the enterprise, and also should be aligned to the cost structure or risk management aspect of the service provider, because all these things need to be in line and in a row. Otherwise, there's a clear chance of misalignment. Now, these models can definitely work, can only work, sorry, if there's something in it for both parties. A one-sided skew, as we've seen, something that either favors the service provider or overtly favors the enterprise. We've seen it as more like a sure shot road to cracks in delivery and the broader relationship, right? In the short term, it may appear that it's given a windfall. It's just not sustainable, right? So that the definition of those units, clear understanding on what are the exceptions, how it's calculated, down to an academic and clinical level is important. One of the other issues which is mentioned in point 4 is that while a lot of the technical and commercial discussions happen on how to move through, the underlying contractual tenets, which should ideally incentivize productivity, efficiency, they refuse to be changed, right? Because again, it's work, it takes more effort, there's legal involved, etc. But if there is proper value to be maintained from these, some of these tenets, like simple things like productivity, service management regime, it could be that maybe in a particular scenario they don't need to be changed significantly, but there could also be scenarios where they do need to be changed, right? So some of those, all in a well-oiled kind of contract, these need to be planned accordingly. So not just the pricing model, but also the associated contractual commercial tenets, right? And then finally, despite the best of intent and planning, things could go wrong. Fallback options are important to have in place. We've seen at least 4 cases across, and I'll cover the gamut over the past year or so. We've been involved in helping rectify 4 scenarios, and this span across, 2 of them were applications focused, 2 of them were actually BPO focused, taking a bit of a digression. So again, there were scenarios where people moved to an output-based kind of model, large organizations. A lot of the planning was done. Some of the planning clearly hadn't, but there was not a fallback option. So clearly, it took way longer than what should have taken to actually get things back on track, right? So net, fallback options are important to have in place. There should be an agreement that, hey, if things don't work as per plan, is there at least an interim fallback option before, rather than having to put both parties into a confusing situation, right? So while this page talks about the journey, on the next page we summarize some of the overall takeaways for enterprises. Now, we've talked about a lot of things about the structure of these models, the motivators, some of the key success factors. Typically, as we can see on the next page, right, the standard approach for us in discussions like these is to talk about the 2 do's, right? Implications, do this, the enterprise should focus on this. Now, in this particular discussion, we thought, I think it'll make more sense to just highlight, when not to go for output-based pricing models. And I'll give a 1-minute, focus on why we actually chose to go for the not to go element. There's always a tendency, right? Some of it is with service providers, some of it is with enterprises, most often with the right intent and focus to try out something new, right? So enterprises, enterprise procurement may want to try a different kind of a pricing model. Conceptually, they agree, they've got some alignment from the business, etc. But as Achin mentioned, some of the prerequisites, we've also mentioned some of the pitfalls, steps, etc. Just having that intent and a theoretical view or a fundamental view that yes, it can add value isn't really enough, right? There are some things which clearly point, at least in the interim or the short term, as a no-go, right? So let me just quickly highlight some of them. So first off, new services with poor existing baselines. You recall I mentioned the importance of data, volume, service level baselines. Clearly, it's very tempting sometimes to start off from the word go, hey, let's take a fresh start, and that's a fresh new canvas. It's very tempting to do that. It has a very high risk, which sometimes reflects in commercials. Either the price goes up because the provider makes in a lot of risk, or some scenarios have not been thought of by either party, and it just leads to unintended consequences. Second point, organizations with a lot of variability in processes often tend to have requests which keep on changing, right? So anything, and I do recognize there was a question also around standardization. anything which keeps on constantly changing, and here I don't mean the number of applications being changing, it's the application underlying requirements being changing. So boxing it into models, either on a per transaction or per application basis, which are based on thin range of assumptions, can again lead to subpar performance commercially, right? So again, with a lot of variability, better to stick with some of the safer models. On a similar vein as point B, highly subjective requirements, right? So stuff like machine learning, NLP-based software development, where there's it's as much as coding based as kind of broader domain experience. Perhaps there could be exceptions, of course, right? But at least in most cases, we've seen not the best candidates to start off with such pricing. For organizations looking to use this for agile, again, it's not wise to use where there's no reference data for story point calculation. Now, again, story point calculation is an interesting theme because, interestingly, within a span of like 2 weeks, we were talking to 2 large financial services organizations, right? Global, pretty much distributed across the world. One of them had been having an extreme level of success with the per story point model. The other was just struggling to get it across, right, or get it off the ground. And I think a lot of it, as we realized, as we peel the onion, it was more to do with the level of which the knowledge management data had been captured, those baselines were captured, and that actually had them in a much better place. So again, especially when looking at agile, having those baselines, having those reference data points are important. Finally, on an organizational level, this needs tight collaboration between procurement, vendor management teams, and delivery or technical teams. Now, for the purposes of taking right assumptions, jointly taking decisions, running those simulations which I spoke about, disjoint teams at a given point in time, at least in the short term, our view would be to stay away. Because clearly, unless they're really, really joined at the hip and totally aligned, the risk of something going wrong eventually during implementation rises. So these were kind of some of the things to just be mindful of. There is, like I said, there's always a temptation to try out something new, but if one or more of these happen to be the case, maybe it just needs a bit more diligence before jumping into it. Now, before we move to kind of Q&A, if we could just go to the next page. Right. So I'll just take less than a minute to kind of cover how we can support as Everest Group, how we typically work with enterprises on this topic, and we could work with typically support across the life cycle, right? Either if it's moving to someone wants to move to an output-based pricing model, right? There's a host of support which we can provide. We've also could do a sole source proposal review where pricing and other tenets could be realized. And then finally, benchmarking existing output-based contracts, because clearly there are many in place. So that normalization, that kind of benchmarking takes a different kind of an approach to input-based. But yes, that's something we'd be happy to talk about should anyone have a question. Back to you, Michael.
Yes, so just by the pages of questions we've gotten and the answer to the last quick poll tells me there's lots of future discussions that are going to happen on that, and we will certainly try to get to answering those questions in an offline mode for those we can't accommodate in the next few minutes we have left in this session. One of the things I did want to make mention of for our enterprises, those that are buyers of services, we're offering a free price check, if you will, to check your current labor rate, see if you're getting a good deal on what you're buying today on an FTE basis, and maybe that gives you an additional incentives to rethink how your deal is being priced. So what we're offering here is a free price check for 3 roles within our standards, out of our standard price book, and we'll take those 3 roles, and then we'll also look at them across 3 different countries. And so it's something we offer to enterprises that are interested in just getting a taste of the services we provide. The things that Abhishek and Shin have been talking about are going to be a little more complex, but let's start the conversation, see how you're doing today, and then we can certainly talk about some of the more advanced features as well as we go, advanced options as we go forward here. So with that, Abhishek, if you have a chance to look at the questions in real time here. We'll do a couple of those. Do you have one? Do you want me to pick one, or do you want to go to it?
Yeah, let me just say this is quite a list, so.
Yeah. So what?
Why don't you pick something up? Otherwise, I'll get.
Yeah.
Pick
So yeah. So they're still coming in here. The impact on AI and machine learning on the future of pricing here. You want to tackle that one? That wasn't directly in your sweet spot there, but any thoughts on that? Since I know that's a hot topic as well.
Yeah, I mean, so why don't we take that offline? Because again, that's a different spin on things, right? So there's one which I just want to cover, right? So there was a question around, are there any benchmarks on application or output-based pricing, for example, for ERP or COTS or for industry-based? So yes, good question. Are there benchmarks? Yes. Are there benchmarks which are kind of pretty standard as just like input-based rates? No. A lot of the benchmarks on the output-based side need a lot of contextualization, right? For if it's per application, a host of the factors which Achint briefly talked about. Even if it's on a per transaction basis, there's a lot of things to be taken into account, like volumes, underlying technology, productivity, scenarios, multiple things. So clearly benchmarks are available. The point is, are they really off the shelf for something that's quickly doable? Perhaps not. Our view always is to, whenever such a benchmarking is required, it should happen through the right kind of channels and with the right rigor. Otherwise, it just, it has a higher chance of being way misinterpreted by both parties.
Okay. Let me take a shot at that AI machine learning on the future of pricing. So we're seeing this in other areas too. And one of the challenges with FTE pricing is you take the incentive if you're using FTE pricing, you take the incentive away from the provider to get aligned with the best interest of reducing the headcount dedicated to it and a service of any kind, whether it be BPO or applications maintenance. And so, the faster you can start to think about, hey, how do we look at this in maybe perhaps an output-based pricing, allows everybody to get better aligned on, hey, how do we use technology to substitute for FTEs? But if you're only going to price on FTEs, you certainly take away all the incentive for applying advanced technologies that can actually reduce the overall human support, which is the largest part of the cost structure right now. All right, you got another question on there?
Yeah, so there was another question around, so is input based the best way to start, followed by output based, and once fairly matured, it should be outcome based pricing. So see, fundamentally, fundamentally, I think there's nothing wrong with the statement, right? That's mentioned. However, there could be a few exceptions, right? There could be a few exceptions. It could be the fact that depending on where you're, how does one define as the start, right? It could be the fact that even when a certain set of applications is being taken over from an incumbent, right, or from an internal service delivery arm, if there is good data available, which you trust, both parties trust, both are comfortable with, and there's the right level of rigor gone in, there's no stopping from actually trying out something like a per ticket kind of a model. Right. The whole premise is the availability of that information and baseline. Now, it could be from another party. It doesn't mean that the party has to do all of it themselves. And there could be a bit of a buffer period before it comes into play. So while fundamentally this is correct, it's also important to notice that it won't be applicable in every case. We've also seen some cases where the stars were aligned and the prerequisites were in place to actually take a slightly more advanced start. But those cases are rarer as compared to many of the other scenarios that we see.
Well, there's a similar question out there about is output-based pricing suitable when you have when you don't have accurate volumes for the business?
Yes. So in that case,
a lot of variability, and there's not a lot of visibility to that variability.
Yeah. Then I think it's a bit of a question mark at that point, because then the effort should be less. I think in the short term, then it should be about getting access to data, improving the data quality, working with them, rather than shifting gears to a different pricing model.
Yeah, and when I listen to you guys talk about this, I really kind of just jumped to, well, you got a really nice stable environment here, and the goal is to drive down the cost in that stable environment. This makes all the sense in the world. You're trying to get, trying to drive down the cost. You're trying to sunset something perhaps, and you can focus on adding efficiencies through advanced technologies. That's an ideal situation.
Yep.
I think where it's most challenge is if you're missing a lot of the key components of predictability.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Let's do one more question here, and then we'll wrap up. Do you have one in mind here? There's a question around standardization. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Mentioned.
Yeah. So standardization and this actually came through before we had covered some of the prerequisites,
right.
As part of the discussion. But as we would have seen, clearly, the more standard things are, because fundamentally these models run on the fact that the provider works on a narrow, mid-narrow kind of set of assumptions, puts in that probability and risk into that, and commits to saying that, hey, this is the charge per ticket, right? Even if the effort goes on a few over and above what I've done, I'll charge for it. This is the charge per application. So the more standard things are, the less the variability, the greater the confidence of the provider, right? And let's be totally honest, right? To offer a competitive price and not make too much of a risk premium. If things conversely are not standardized, there's a huge variation. One ticket could take 7 hours, the other could take 14 hours. There could be a few which take 2 hours, just depending on the nature of based on multiple factors. The client's business environment, client's technology environment, estate, etc. Clearly not suitable, because then the tendency is for the provider to bake in the maximum amount of risk, right? Which clearly then takes away any benefit, at least commercially, which happens to be one of the major motivators, as we saw in the poll as well, to bring about that benefit. So again, a level of standardization is important. A completely variable or an environment in flux, right, of processes, maybe not the right thing to start with.
All right, fantastic. Abhishek, just based on the level of participation, both in participants and in questions, obviously a hot topic to follow this. I'm sure we're going to try to follow up on some of these questions individually where we were not able to address them on the actual webinar. And I wanted to point to our blog here if you're interested in getting more information that's available for free. Also look at our related content that will cover some of these topics in the market overall. And thank you for your time today, and let us know if we can help you in any way.
Thank you to Michael, Abhishek, and Anshant. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, you will receive a follow-up email within 1 to 2 business days with a link to download the presentation slides, along with accessing the on-demand playback of today's live session. In addition, please be sure to check out Everest Group complimentary resources to access their current perspectives on sourcing innovation and other global sourcing topics. On behalf of Everest Group and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.